Hello and welcome back. This is the second video for the paper 2 walkthrough for English literature for the modern text and poetry. We're going to do the poetry section today. I did realise that in my first video. Please ignore that actually I missed out 10 minutes. So you may want to change it to AIC 45 minutes, Power and Conflict 45 minutes, Unseen Remains at 35 and Unseen Comparison at 10. But obviously you break these down to do those extra 5 minutes I've just placed on the first two are your 5 minutes of planning anyway. Just to clarify, I am an English teacher, not a maths teacher, and I've had a moment. So we're going to do the poetry question, which is the Power and Conflict one, which is equally worth 30 marks. There are some stag marks as well, but I'm just not going to really include them in this. So 30 marks, it's a big question. It's your second biggest question, you have to answer it. And this will be based on the 15 poems you studied. So it tells us, if we turn over, it tells us that it is on page 19, because we found it in the last video. So turn to page 19. So you've got to go past quite a few pages in the booklet. Just ignore them. And then on page 19, we actually have the question. On page 18, though, you also have the list of poems you have studied with the poet's names. So if you do blank that piece of information, you can't remember it, don't panic, you're actually given that list, so you don't have to remember it. Looking at the question, it's always the same. It always says compare how poets present the effect, compare how the poets present, and they'll always give you a topic. So in this case, it's the effects of war. Now, it could be anything from any of the main themes. So, for example, nature, institutions. It could be about people's experiences. So it's any of the themes that we've actually covered that you can cross over. But they will give you a theme. So this one's on the effect of war. So you need to think about that not only physically but mentally. In Bayonet Charge and in one other poem from the Power and Conflict. So that is the poem you're given, but you've got to remember one other poem. So you need to have done quite a lot of revision to be able to have actually answered this question, because there are 15 poems. If you get the one in front of you, it's actually really important to think about and break down the question. So when we think about the effects of war, you have the mental and you do have the physical. So you can cover both points within your written analysis, because it's not just about the physical effects of war on somebody, it's the mental effects of war on them too. And you could talk about individual experience. You might want to talk about a collective experience, what maybe the difference between that is. There's lots of different ways you can answer that, but you need to interpret what you're going to say about the theme and what you think you can say. And Bayonet Charge is about the soldier who is running through the trenches. And he becomes quite slowly disillusioned by what he's actually seeing around him, and suddenly realises that he is basically a cog in a machine. He realises that he's not that important and that he just needs to survive and go through. And this one was written by Ted Hughes, and if you remember some of the context behind this poem, Ted Hughes was never in the war. He's imagined it from stories that his father told him and his grandfather told him about being in the war. So it's actually written very differently from anybody who actually experienced the war, because it's done from an imagined place, which does affect actually how it's been written. And then you've got to think about one other poem that you could do it to. So there's a range you could compare this with, and you've just got to decide which one you know best. I'd be very tempted to compare it with Remains, just because you could compare it to a modern conflict, or I'd be very Exposure could be one, but anything where there's some form of war going on or the effects. I mean, War Photographer could work, because he's not a soldier, but he's actually a photographer and he does take pictures of the war, so it'd just be an interesting comparison to make between actually there's similar issues going on. But if I was going to do it, really, I think I would choose Exposure, just because they both share a common theme about not being important and the effect and not being really valued by society as well, and seeing the situation as out of their control and how they feel like they've just been left alone, because exposure does talk about that a lot. So I personally go with that, but you can pick, there's lots that you could have chosen for comparison. So once you've thought through and you think, oh, I recognise Bayonet Charge, and I think I know what that poem's about, what other poem would be a good one, choose the poem. What you then need to do is make sure you use Art Wars. When you go through the poem. So you need to make sure you think about what it is about. And that's not simply the story of the poem. You need to think about the theme of the poem. So what is actually the purpose of the poem? What is the message? Or the key theme that runs through it? And it will just lift your answer a little bit further. So, for example, a theme in this could be a disillusionment with the establishment. So the idea that he feels like he has been abandoned by his country halfway through, that he feels like all he has is survival. That could be a theme or a message. The idea that war is brutal and cruel. It doesn't matter really what time period that is as well. It's pretty much a standard thing that gets discussed across all the poetry. So make sure you have a strong thing about that. The R stands for repetition. So you can look for repeated ideas. You can look for repeated words. You can look for semantic fields or lexical fields, depending which word your teacher's been using with you. And talk about the effect that language has, linking it to what the message is and what effect it's meant to have on the reader. This one is tone. So is it positive or negative at a very basic level? But then past that, you can start using much better vocabulary to describe the tone. Is he disillusioned, upset? Is he frightened, terrified? Is he confused, bamboozled? She says bewildered in there. Then you need to look for a word or phrase that you're really going to zoom in on. And this is where you really zoom in on using your Peter skills. That you think is really important in the poem. You've got A for alliteration. Sometimes there isn't alliteration in a poem, but if there is, why might it be? Remember, alliteration is about creating sounds, and therefore making it feel like you're part of the actual poem and you're experiencing the poem. Alliteration usually is used to make you feel like you're there, and it's also to engage the senses. So this one does have alliteration because it's got lots of sibilants in it actually, which is alliteration with S's. But the cool word is sibilants, and it kind of mimics the sound of like gunfire while it's going through, so it creates that involvement for the reader and the feel like you're there with him, running beside this man going through the field. The next R is rhyme and rhythm. And you should be able to know what kind of, whether it rhymes or not. You can do it down the side. So raw, heavy, hedge, hearing, air, arm, eye, chest. None of that rhymes. So there is no rhyme in this one. And there'll be a reason why there's no rhyme. And you've got to obviously revise the poem and be able to explain why. And then think about the rhythm. It's quite fast paced, this poem, because he is obviously running through until you get to this section where it becomes actually a lot slower, because you've got the stopping, the asking of the questions, a lot of caesura in the middle of the sentences about him considering. It's almost like time stops for him when he realises he has an enlightened moment about being in the battlefield. And then lastly is structure. And the structure is enjambment and caesura and stuff like that, but it does go under rhythm a little bit as well. Spelled rhyme twice. So rhythm and rhyme, and then also structure. So what you should do is you should spend your time using Art Wars and annotate the poem and pick out the things you want to talk about. And then once you've done that, what you can do is, from what you remember from the other poem, a really simple thing to do is to just do this. Put Bayonet Charge on one side, put the other poem that you want to do. I'm just going to put exposure there. And you can do your art walls down the side if you wanted to. Instead of writing something out twice, if you've annotated the poem and you've got all of that for bayonet charge, fine. I'm going to put another one here. You can put this little box anywhere you want, but it says similar and different. So you could go for exposure as well and do the same thing. What you can remember from exposure. Don't panic if you don't remember everything, but it is really about how much revision you put into something. And once you've art walls both and you've thought it through to yourself, think about what is similar and different about how it's presented. And also ask yourself the question, which is more effective on the reader? Because then you're comparing and evaluating. Which one's better at getting across their overall message, their overall idea? Which one really makes you experience it, feel something, take away from, like, can really visualize it, for example? Which one really does that for you? And say why. Give a reason. And that should be your planning process for the poetry. If you turn over, it's the same for the unseen poetry. You can do, the unseen poetry is a poem you've never seen before in your life. And if you do question 27.1, they will give you the question. It's usually the same. It says, how does the poet present the effects of the season of the autumn? So it'll always be about what the poet is doing, and it's the effects. So you've got to talk about how it makes the reader feel, and that's the poem you're given. Again, you just art walls it. Okay, so as you go through, sometimes you won't get the about until last, because if you do all of this first, you usually can get a good idea about the about, like what the message is, what the poet really wants you to take away from the poem. So make sure you annotate it as you go through. So if there's any repetition in there, repetition of ideas or thoughts, what tone you think it is. So tone is how it's being said. So is it said joyfully or happily? Is it solemn and grave and serious? So it depends on the tone of the poem. Pick a particular phrase you like. When you do the words, by the way, make sure you talk about, and you actually do label techniques. So similes, metaphors, personification. Can be as basic as adjectives and verbs as well when you really break it down. And again, alliteration, rhyme and rhythm, and then structure. So all of these should really be done, and it should only take you, remember this is 24 marks, so it's slightly less, and on the thing this should take you about 35 minutes to do. And they're quite positive when they mark those, and just make sure you write out your answer using art walls to help you structure it. Then if you go on to the second part of the poetry, you get a comparison question. And it's only worth 8 marks. It should only take you 10 minutes to do this question. So, for example, you're going to have to compare it with the one you've just done here. So you have to do this one first before you do this one. It says, in both today and autumn, the speakers describe attitudes towards the season. So you already know the about. They're not asking you to compare what the poems are about. What they are asking you, though, to talk about is what are the similarities and differences between the ways the poets present these attitudes. Ways means techniques. So that means similes and metaphors, make a direct comparison, and personification and all the others. So similes, metaphors and all that stuff. They want you to compare the structure they use, maybe the rhyme and rhythm, and then you've also got the idea of, you could possibly also is allowed is tone. You can compare their tone of voice in which they do things, or a particular word. So that's really something here, so words or phrases. So really, when you're comparing these, so what they want you to do is compare the techniques that have been used and which one does it better. That is what they're asking you to do. So when you talk about similarities and differences, you're talking about which is doing it better. And you only really need, this is only really a 2-paragraph answer. So it should be quite short because you've only got 10 minutes. You shouldn't be spending pages and pages. It should be about 2 paragraphs. Once you've done that, find the things that you find that are similar. Find one thing that's similar and one thing that's different. If you're very fast, obviously find two things that are similar and two things that are different, and make sure it's technique based. So maybe they have very similar structures or very different structures. Maybe they both rhyme, and think about why both rhyme and what's the effect of that rhyme. And how actually the way the rhyme is used may have a slightly different effect on the tone. You could pick out a simile from one and a metaphor from another, and so how they've used language differently. So it should be really simple to do. I mean, really, in Art Wars, what you're really doing is you can do anything from, really, it's from the wars section that you're really thinking about. You can pick anything from there to talk about. And you can do a plan on your paragraphs using wars as well. So what's similar and different between the two poems, so poem 1 and poem 2. And just write down whether does this one rhyme and this one doesn't rhyme. And then say why that is and what effect it has on the reader. And you must always talk about the effect on the reader. And that should be it.